So good morning, good weekend. Of course, if you're watching this in the future, I hope yesterday was good. It's Monday morning when I first stream this. So, what should we think about this morning? I found again, it was over the weekend rather than today's, I think, little verse that popped up, which is from an area which I've touched on a few times with Luke 16 and the parable of the unrighteous steward, but it was actually drawing me past that into the bits that Jesus goes on to. It just kind of got me thinking and about a word, the word's abomination, because it appears in there. So at the end of the parable, Jesus is talking about, he talks about being righteous with unrighteous mammon. But the word can also be faithful. It's faithful with unfaithful mammon. So in one of my books, I think it's the Supernatural Hope book. I kind of translated it as be faithful with fickle, which I felt a little bit awkward about because obviously I'm using two slightly different words in English for what was the underlying same Greek word. But there are occasions when you're doing that kind of translation-y side of things where that is appropriate style-wise, and because English doesn't like repetition. We kind of notice it in written text if you're using the same word all the time, particularly if it's an unusual-ish type of word. it kind of so anyway, but that's totally irrelevant. I was thinking about that over the weekend because I've been doing the kind of translation for the text for the teaching series I'm looking to start at the end of September. I've got this issue. Sorry, I'm going off on a tangent already, aren't I? I've got this issue with what you do with the Greek word tote. I think that's how you pronounce it. The trouble is, all most of my language I've taught myself, so I don't always sit down and chat it with people, which kind of means then. But Matthew uses it in a much more Aramaic or Hebrew way. If you look at the word then in the Old Testament, if the word then is normally just a kind of prefix, if it actually appears as a word, I can't remember what the word is now, what you actually find is its meaning is more a literary joining than it is a temporal joining. In other words, it's less to do with this would happen at 10 o'clock, then this happened at 10:15. That's joining things temporally, which is what we do in English and Greek. And so I've been kind of translating it in various ways, as so. That also this kind of thing, because really it's to kind of get across the fact. But I kind of feel like, well, a good translation technique ought to kind of always reflect the same word for the same Greek word. Trouble is, it's impossible to do it 100%. So there's always a degree of it. So I just figure, okay, sometimes you have to embrace it, and so I put a little note saying in Matthew's Gospel when I hit this word, it will be translated in a variety of ways, just to kind of create a sort of a much more readable narrative flow. And anyway, so I suppose that's related, because the thing that struck me is so at the end of that parable where Jesus has been talking about being faithful and using your mammon, and that word you see is there's several of these words where how do you translate the word mammon? And so older translations just transliterate it. Mammon. Newer ones tend to put the word riches, and riches is not a bad choice, because I know what they're driving at, and it's difficult, you see, to kind of find an exact word, because there's not total agreement on how the word should be translated, and you're trying to kind of sit, because it's not, some just put monies in, but money, that doesn't make sense, because why not just use the word money? Jesus uses a slightly broader word. So what we can say about the word mammon, and then we're going to come to abomination in a minute. And it's just interesting to note, the thing I'll say here is that the word abomination there in this passage is linked to money. Because we very often, I'll just flag this now, we think of the word abomination with some sort of deviation of behaviour. And often that has a sexual kind of connotation to it. So we often kind of make abomination something to do with sexual depravities. But you notice that Jesus is actually using it in this, where he's talking about money, and he's also talking about money that he's told us to be faithful with. So that's the kind of thing to notice, and just as we get there. But but he uses the word mammon, and as I've touched on before, and I did in the Supernatural Hope book, he seems, I think, the best understanding. I know nobody's 100% agreed on it, but the use seems to come from Arabic. We find the kind of similar word there in Semitic Arabic, and it seems to be much more related to the skills and things that I have that allow me to make a living, to allow me to kind of generate wealth, create wealth, and so on. And that makes sense in the context. That that's something that you can be faithful with. See, so Jesus does. He says, "Be faithful with it." With fickle mammon, we can be faithful with it, but the trouble is we shouldn't rely on it because it doesn't always work for us. So be faithful with what you've got in those ways. So if you're a musician, be faithful. And what does to be faithful mean? It doesn't just mean I play every day. It means I use my gift in a way that honours the Lord. If I'm good at organising numbers, then maybe I should become an accountant. But if I am an accountant, which is because this is now part of my mammon, how do I do my accountancy in a way that honours the Lord? If rather than organising numbers, I'm good at seeing deeply into them, then I do something more mathematical in engineering. But how do I do that in a way that is faithful, i.e. it reflects something of my faith and relationship with the creator of the universe? So the question always is, with the things I've got, how do I actually honour God through the gifts and the skills and the ability to create wealth and the advantageous positions I may not have been born into, all of those things that kind of go into my mammon? How do I do that and use that in a way that honours God? And then Jesus has to kind of caveat it as he moves on. This is the verse I was looking at, and saying, he said, but because the trouble with the Pharisees is, and you see, this is Luke 16, so this is now, the 72 have gone out. This is the kind of period not dominated by the 12, it's a period dominated where the 12 are organising the 72 in terms of mission. And Jesus has now got women who are disciples who are learning from him, sitting at his feet. We know the story of Mary. We start to pick up, both from the early church and you start to pick it up in Scripture, that a number of the other women are much more active now as disciples. They're not just kind of following along. And we get evidence of that because Jesus has told parables which make sense to women, i.e. the parable of the lost coin. See, it's not just allegorical sense. All of Jesus' parables have an emotionally engaging context to them. So Jesus draws in local colour when he's in local situations. Why? Because he wants to engage people. So when Jesus tells the parable of the lost coin, it's because there are women listening, not because he's just being purely allegorical and it was a good allegory. So we're in that kind of phase and that period of Jesus' ministry, and therefore we are able to kind of place it, because we know that period happens to the east and slightly north. So east and to the north, it kind of runs around the edge. It's centred nearish Jerusalem, but slightly north and slightly to the east. There's bits where Jesus gets out to where the Dead Sea joins the where the Jordan runs into the Dead Sea. He's there at one point. That's where he gets news of Lazarus's sickness, for instance. He's up at Jericho as he circles through Ephraim. He's been based in Ephraim, which is kind of in the border. It's slightly north of Jerusalem, the border with Samaria. So there's all of these kind of things. So this is part of Jesus' southern ministry phase. Now, why am I drawing on that? So it's the 72 going out. It's down in the south. Well, the reason for saying that is because this area is dominated by the wealthy Pharisees. Just socio-politically, and so therefore, of course, they become part of the context of Jesus' storytelling, and therefore we recognise how there is a sense in which the stories are deliberately to provoke some sort of emotional understand the kind of context. So in this context where he's been flagging with money, there is something that the Pharisees probably in mind here are people who are looking to engage with Jesus. They're not they're not the rulers of the Pharisees. They're the problem, the ones who are based in Jerusalem, and they've stirred things up. But most Pharisees see wisdom in Jesus, and they want to follow and they want to be there. So there are times when the Pharisees say to him, "But you're not talking about us, surely." And Jesus' answer is sort of, it's not quite, but if the shoe fits, it's kind of, okay, examine yourself and work it out. And that's part of the context here. So Jesus says then to the Pharisees about you justify yourself, which is that there are elements that have always been part of that, which are correct. Jesus says, be faithful with those things that are fickle, but that you've got. That actually you do live well and sensibly and manly, live generously, all these. But actually the tension, which I think is why we're seeing, and it's causing quite a stir, people kind of, because of the way he's kind of effectively confessed and apologised for some of the way he's preached it, is because it transitions into something which Jesus addresses right here. So Jesus has been teaching, if you like, the beginnings of a prosperity gospel, but then he puts a very strong full stop on how far it goes. Because actually, and the reason is because in the end, wealth then becomes a spiritual justification. And it's a kind of a commonly understood thing, and you find it in the rabbinic writings, you find it all sorts of non-biblical writings, and you find it in Christianity and in Judaism, where effectively someone's wealth shows the blessings of God, and therefore the wealthier they are, the better person, the morally the better person they are. And so Jesus says, you're justifying yourself before men with your position and the things that you've done. You've been so successful, you must be spiritual. It's kind of the logic of it. And then he kind of turns it around and says, but that's an abomination. That's what the word exactly. It's anyway. Not that that means very much to me. I just kind of you read the words, you don't get the shape of the language if you're me anyway. But the point of the thing is that the word actually means something that's detestable. You see, so something detestable. So then what we do is we turn it into abomination, which either comes from the Latin. So I think, isn't it? Or is it Greek? Oh well. So sometimes it's Latin through Greek or Greek through Latin. But ab kind of is away from, and either nomenim, which is from the law, moving away from the law, or hominem, which is away from humanity, i.e. unnatural. And so we get a word in English which is loaded with the idea of either on one side illegal, or on the other side, if you like, unnatural. But the word itself, detestation, something detestable, it's something that's detestable to God, actually is used through the Old Testament for idolatry. It's an idol. It's become something that gets in the way of God. And so actually the flow of what Jesus is saying, and he would have spoken in Hebrew Aramaic or Aramaic Hebrew, the kind of Aramaicized version of Hebrew that's being spoken particularly in synagogues, but probably the marketplace is kind of very similar. Jesus is using quite a normal word. He's saying it's actually becoming something that's now getting in the way of God. He said, if you celebrate your mammon, that's right, so if you celebrate mammon, if you kind of, because you made a big thing of it, you justified yourself with it, now you celebrate. As you celebrate it, that's an abomination. Because celebration, of course, we forget, because we just think we celebrate birthdays and whatever, is actually a spiritual concept. It's kind of turning it into something spiritual, which is what I was saying. So obviously what they're doing is they justify themselves before other people. We must be more spiritual than you, therefore my opinion in church matters more than you, because I have more spiritual success than you, and I can show you, because look how ordered my life is. My mammon is making the most of me, your mammon is a total mess. So it's not an unknown argument in our churches today. We would like more religious order, so we don't want those who are a bit of a mess. Now, you see, it's not that there's no logic in it, but it's just not spiritual. And actually the problem can be, then, what happens is, that thing becomes the thing that is the heart of our celebration, and so therefore it's become an idol. It's very kind of simple. So it's nothing deviant or illegal about it, it's just something that now has got in the way of God. And God finds that detestable. God doesn't now detestable, but it kind of, because actually what he desires is connection with us. And so it's a kind of a really good balance. that the parable of the unrighteous steward is you need to kind of get wiser like the rest of the world is. Use your finances in ways that bless people, benefit people. If you've got the option to do them good, why don't you do it? Even in my story, where you think the guy was a bit illegal, but didn't he do well for himself? And actually people will love him into eternity for that. Not just in this life, but they'll remember them. So do it in those ways, but also if you're successful in it, don't kind of now celebrate that as something spiritual, because that becomes an idolatry, it becomes an abomination, the word. And that of course then gets into the relationship that the Lord wants with you and which he really desires, and actually therefore it's something that he really annoys him, if I can put it that way. So that's not downplaying the word too much. And of course it's not just, because the word mammon is broader than just money, it's not just money, it's just love of money is the root of all kinds of evil things, as Jesus says, but actually it's mammon, it's just a slightly broader thing. It's all those things that seem to be so good in life, which we are challenged to be faithful with, but we hold them loosely. We don't make them an idol, we don't celebrate them in a way where they have taken the place. And actually we identify, it's not that everything becomes an idol, we identify what's become an idol to us when it becomes the thing that if we don't have it, somehow we feel God's rejected us. Or if we don't have it, I can't follow the Lord. God can change anything in me, but he's not allowed to change that. We should have none of those things. We say, oh yes, but this is such a good thing, so that he shouldn't change that. But it's just the kind of the simple thing of it can be a good thing. It can be something you're supposed to be faithful with. Is you steward it and you administer it, but you don't celebrate it. And I think at this level, if you like, the flow of this parable actually then has an awful lot to say to kind of some of the obsession that the Western world now has with individual identity, of all spectrums. Because we can easily look at some and say, well, that's identity with something evil, we're not going to do that. But actually there are all sorts of ones where, no, but this is who I am becomes the most important thing, because who I am, well, actually I am a musician, that's my mammon. So it's really important. And those things do become a kind of an idolatry. And it's not that God kind of says, oh dear, you're enjoying too much the gifts I gave you, so I'm going to punish you. It is much more that we want to be faithful with them. We want to celebrate them within the context of celebrating God. We want to use the gift we have, as we started by saying, in a way that honours the Lord. But we need to watch ourselves that it doesn't start to become that's the thing. And sadly, I have to say, I think a lot of worship culture goes that way. It starts with really good people, and there are some fantastic worship leaders who I really do admire. But then you also notice how sometimes it creeps in, and we kind of there was a parody, I used to find it on YouTube, with a worship leader singing the words of the song he's written, which is "Look at me worshipping you." And there is something of that spirit that can sometimes kind of creep in, because somehow we celebrate, if you like, we live in a culture that celebrates performance, and so we get up, and so I'm not a musician, so I suppose I'm not going to talk about that, because I'm never going to fall into that sin, because I'm so rubbish at music. But let's say my speaking and teaching ability, I can suddenly, it's kind of, look at me teaching you. But I need to keep it submitted to the Lord, to serve his agenda, not my agenda, to celebrate him with it rather than to celebrate it and let it get in the way of the intimacy of relationship I have with us. And so, as I say, it's not that God's going to then slap you for enjoying the gifts he's given you. It's much more that actually just as a kind of a pain of the breaking of relationship. And most parents have noticed it. Fortunately, our kids aren't. But those moments where our kids get more excited about the gifts than they do about us, and because we're gracious parents, we don't slap them around and tell them off, but we feel it, and we love it when they suddenly realise that actually you were more important than the gift, and they come throwing their arms around you, and the relationship is all there. But for a moment, as a parent, you carry it, and the Lord feels it, and it really gets in the way of what he most desires, and he knows in the end is better for us. Because here's the weird thing, every time a child is hugging, particularly a very young child is hugging a parent, there are good things growing in their brain. I'll put it that way. In other words, it's good for them mentally, for the long term. All sorts of benefits come out of the intimacy they have with their parents, which they don't understand, they don't get it. It doesn't feel one moment suddenly, oh, I've been improved, but you have been. Your overarching psychology is being strengthened and developed and shaped in a way that will set you up well for the future. So it's good for you to have that intimacy rather than just to play in the corner with the latest iPad. So I seem to have gone all over the place, and I can sound like a bit preachy or judgmental, which is not my intention at all, because I put myself in the frame all the time on these things. I need to ask it of myself, to what degree am I using the fact that I'm good in this to kind of justify its importance in the bigger scheme of things, because that actually elevates me. So suddenly what's happening is by making God in our image, see, that's why God hates idolatry, is that we end up making God in our image. So I celebrate my teaching gift. So now I think that the teaching gift is the most important thing in all of churches, and if the church doesn't have good teaching, I would never go there, even though their worship and their prayer and loads of people are getting healed. Because, you see, for me, I'm a teacher, so I judge the church according to teaching as if it's the only thing. See, I'm making teaching something idolatrous. If worship is your thing, you can put up with terrible teaching. You can put up with the fact that actually social action is not really happening and caring for those, and there's no real pastoral structure, but the worship is fantastic. You see, so we then take our thing, and so because it's got in the way of God, what we've done is we've made God in our image. That's how it's got in the way, and so we end up celebrating God in a way that actually lifts us up and makes us more important, which is why it's such a temptation to do it. It's why the Pharisees were doing it. We find the thing we're good at and we make that important to God to the point that it becomes God, gets in the way of our relationship, but all the time really what it's doing is elevating us. So when we recognise that, we need to then kind of, if you like, take a broader, more open-handed view and say, well, it's not my style of church, but I'm so grateful for what they're doing. And I want to be so supportive, and if that means I get along to there instead of over to here, all of those kinds of questions and things that kind of come along. Then what we are doing is we're genuinely, if you like, expressing with our lives. Let me add my gift into your mix, if I can put it that way. The things that you've got, which I notice you're not as good at me at that, but doesn't mean that I'm more spiritual than you, but let me at least put what I've got into the mix with you, and I can be faithful with what I've got, because in the end we are trying to reach out in our love for a God who is so much bigger than any one strand or thread. We can't, even in something as generic as money, which we use in all aspects of life, doesn't kind of capture enough the breadth and depths and intricacies and richness of the life of God. So anyway, best shut up now, I think, because I think I kind of waxed moral for too long now. It's good to kind of get out in the mornings. When I preach at my phone like this, I'm also speaking to myself. So I'm kind of deliberately giving myself the benefit of a good sermon. So I say it's a good. Sorry, that's terrible, isn't it? It's a good sermon. Good sermon. What I mean is I'm kind of hopefully it's good for you too. Hopefully it speaks to your soul and kind of challenges, shapes us. Not in a way to condemn us, but actually always, if we're going to waste time listening to someone talk, my prayer is always that in one sense it challenges us in a way, it makes us uncomfortable in a way that's quite manageable and actually leads us somewhere positive. So pray that's the case this morning. I will release you. I'm sure people have moved on by now anyway, if they don't like what they're listening to. To have a really fantastic day, be blessed in Jesus. Not to let the arguments of the world get into and rob us of the peace that he gives us, the security he gives us, the surety he gives us, the future he gives us in any way, in Jesus' name. Amen. I'll turn the camera around because we've hardly seen the dogs. I've just got so into it this morning. They're way ahead of me now. You probably can't see them. Let's step out this way. Yeah. Luna's looking into the trees. Oh, here you come. Come on. Why don't you run up? Let's have a nice view. Banjo. Come on, Banjo. Final shots. As we kind of head to the point where I hit the button and turn it all off. Luna, come on. This way. Let's do a nice running in shot. Yeah. Okay, bye then.